The afternoon sun was fading behind the tall buildings, leaving long shadows across the busy street. Cars rushed by, horns echoed in the air, and people hurried along the sidewalks carrying bags, phones, and food in their hands. Among the noise and movement sat a thin young girl near a cafe corner. Her face was pale, her hair tangled, and her old shirt was too big for her small frame. She held a violin case beside her, worn out with scratches that told a story of its own. Her stomach growled softly. She hadn't eaten since the morning before. Still, she tried to sit with a straight back, trying not to look as desperate as she felt. The smell of bread and coffee from the cafe made her mouth water. She looked through the glass at people laughing, eating, taking photos of their food. For a long time, she just watched. Then slowly, she gathered courage. She stood up, holding her violin close to her chest, and walked to a small group sitting outside the cafe. They looked comfortable, dressed nicely, laughing at jokes she couldn't understand. Her voice was small but steady when she spoke. "Excuse me," she said, her fingers trembling slightly. "May I play a song for you? For a piece of food?" There was silence for a second. One man looked up from his coffee, surprised. Then a few of them started to laugh. One woman covered her mouth, whispering to another. "You want to play for food?" one man said. "That's new. We usually get singers begging for money, not violin players." They all laughed again, not out of cruelty perhaps, but out of the comfort that comes from never being hungry. The girl forced a smile, though her eyes filled with tears. "Yes," she said softly, "just for a piece of bread." The man waved his hand dismissively. "Go on, little one. Try somewhere else. We're busy." Her heart sank. She nodded quietly, stepped back and walked away, clutching her violin case tighter. She could still hear them laughing behind her, and each laugh felt like a small stone thrown at her chest. She turned into a quieter street, her eyes blurry from tears. She sat near an old wall and opened her violin case. Inside lay a violin that had once been beautiful but was now worn and dull. The bow's hair was frayed, and a small crack ran along the edge of the wood. Still, when she touched it, her hands were gentle, like someone touching a memory. That violin had belonged to her mother. Her mother used to play it at weddings and small gatherings. She remembered how her mother's eyes used to shine when she played, how music made her seem strong even when life was hard. But those days were gone now. Her mother had fallen sick a year ago, and after a long struggle, she was gone. The girl had no one left. Their small rented room was taken away after her mother's death, and since then she had been surviving on streets, sometimes doing small chores for food, sometimes playing her violin near the park for coins. Now she sat with that same violin staring at it. The city lights started to flicker on one by one. People passed her by, some glancing quickly and looking away. She took a deep breath and whispered, "Mama, I'll play again today. Maybe someone will listen." She lifted the violin and placed it under her chin. The first few notes came out rough, but then her hands found the rhythm. The sound floated into the air, soft and trembling like the voice of a child telling a secret. She closed her eyes as she played. The world around her disappeared. The cars, the lights, the laughter, everything faded, and only the sound remained. It was a melody her mother used to play when she couldn't sleep, a song that always made her feel safe. People began to slow down as they passed her. Some stopped. Some smiled. A little boy tugged at his mother's hand and said, "Mom, she's really good." The mother nodded but didn't stop. A few coins dropped into the open violin case. Not much, but enough to make her heart lift. She kept playing until her fingers hurt, and when she stopped, her hands were shaking from both hunger and emotion. She gathered the coins, barely enough for a small bread roll, and walked to a nearby bakery. The man behind the counter looked at her dirty hands and torn shoes but said nothing. He took the coins, handed her a piece of bread, and turned away. She whispered thank you so quietly that no one heard. She sat outside and ate slowly, savoring each bite as if it were the best meal in the world. She saved a small piece for later, wrapping it in paper and keeping it safe in her violin case. As the night deepened, she returned to the same street corner. The light from a broken lamp flickered above her, but it was enough to see by. She played again, this time not for food or money, but for herself. The music poured out like a story, of hunger, of loneliness, of a little girl who still had hope even when life gave her so little. One man walking by stopped for a long moment. He was older, with gray hair and tired eyes, wearing a long coat. He stood quietly, listening. There was something in her music that reminded him of his past, something raw and real. When she finished, he walked closer. "You play beautifully," he said gently. The girl looked up, surprised. "Thank you," she said softly. "Where did you learn?" he asked. "My mother taught me," she replied. "She used to play before she got sick." The man nodded slowly. "You must have loved her very much." She looked down. "She was all I had." He didn't ask more. He looked at the violin, the worn bow, the way she held it as if it were her last piece of home. "Do you play here every night?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes. Sometimes people stop. Sometimes they don't." He smiled faintly. "Keep playing. One day they'll stop and listen. You have something rare." Then he walked away, disappearing into the streetlights. The girl sat for a while, his words echoing in her mind. She didn't know who he was, but his kindness warmed her more than the bread had. She lifted the violin again and whispered, "Did you hear that, Mama? Someone said I have something rare." And she played again, softly, gently, the notes floating up into the night sky like tiny prayers. When she finally packed her violin and lay down near a closed shop to sleep, she wasn't smiling, but she wasn't crying either. She had been laughed at that day, humiliated and hungry, but she had also played her music and someone had listened. Maybe that was enough for now. As she closed her eyes, she promised herself that one day she would play on a real stage, under bright lights, not for food, but for the world to hear her mother's songs. The city hummed around her, busy and unaware. But somewhere, in that dark corner of the street, a small light still shone, the light of a little girl's determination and a violin's quiet song. That night the wind was cold and sharp. The girl sat curled against the wall, her violin case beside her. She couldn't sleep. The words of the old man who had stopped to listen kept echoing in her head. "You have something rare." She didn't know what he meant exactly, but it made her heart feel warm. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to her kindly. Most people only looked at her with pity or ignored her as if she didn't exist. But that man's voice had been different, soft, honest, and filled with something she hadn't felt in a while: respect. The next morning she woke up to the sound of footsteps. Shops were opening, people were rushing to work, and the world was moving again. She rubbed her eyes, packed her violin carefully, and stood up. Her stomach was empty, but she didn't complain. Hunger had become part of her days now. She walked to the same street corner near the cafe where she had tried to play the day before. For a long time she just stood there, unsure. Part of her wanted to walk away, to never face those laughing faces again. But another part whispered that she shouldn't run. She had her violin, and that was her only weapon in a world that didn't care. So she sat down, opened her case, and started to play. At first, no one noticed. The city was loud, buses, horns, people talking into phones. But slowly the notes began to rise above the noise. They were soft at first, then stronger. The sound was full of feeling, sad but beautiful. Her bow moved like it had its own soul. People started turning their heads. Some stopped to listen. A few dropped coins, but she didn't stop to look. She kept her eyes closed, lost in her music. In those moments, she forgot she was hungry. She forgot the cold, the laughter, and the pain. The violin became her voice, the only way she knew how to tell the world who she was and what she had been through. As she played, she remembered her mother. She remembered the evenings when her mother would sit by the window, playing the same song while she watched. Back then, even when they had no money, music had made their tiny room feel warm and full of hope. When she finished, people clapped softly. A few smiled at her before walking away. She bowed her head politely. Just then, a familiar voice spoke behind her. "You played beautifully again." She turned and saw the same old man from last night. He was standing there with a cup of coffee in one hand and a small bag in the other. "I brought you something," he said. He handed her the bag. Inside was a sandwich and an apple. Her eyes widened. "Thank you," she said shyly. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," he interrupted gently. "No one should play music on an empty stomach." She smiled a little. "It's been a while since I ate breakfast." He nodded. "I guess that." He sat down on the bench beside her. "You remind me of someone I used to know, a young musician who played with heart." She looked at him curiously. "Was she your student?" He smiled. "He was my student," he corrected softly. "Many years ago."
He had talent like yours.
But sometimes life gives us hard tests and not everyone gets a chance to keep playing. She listened quietly, taking small bites of the sandwich. It was the best food she'd had in days. After a moment, he asked, "Do you come here every day?" She nodded, "Mostly. I play here or near the park. Sometimes people give me coins, sometimes food. I just play." He looked at her violin closely. The wood was old, cracked near the edge, the strings dull from age. "That violin has seen a lot, hasn't it?" he asked. She touched it gently. "It was my mother's. She taught me everything I know. She used to say the violin can speak when words can't." He looked at her with kind eyes. "Your mother was a wise woman," she smiled faintly. "She was. But she got sick and I couldn't help her." Her voice broke a little. "Now it's just me." The man was silent for a while. Then he said, "Do you know who I am?" She shook her head. "My name is Darius," he said. "I used to be a conductor for the city's youth orchestra. I retired a few years ago." Her eyes widened. "You mean you teach music?" He nodded. "I did for many years. I still teach a few students at home sometimes. But it's been a while since I've met anyone who plays like you." She blushed. "I'm not that good. My bow shakes sometimes and I can't read music well anymore." He chuckled softly. "Playing with heart matters more than playing with perfect notes. And you play with more heart than most people I've seen." She didn't know what to say. Compliments were rare for her, and this one felt too big. He continued, "If you'd like, you could come by my small studio tomorrow. I can help you fix your violin, maybe teach you a few things." Her eyes filled with surprise. "You mean you'll teach me? For free?" He smiled. "Yes, for free. But only if you promise to work hard." She hesitated. She had learned not to trust easily. People often offered kindness only to take something later. But there was something about his face. Calm, honest, familiar somehow. She nodded slowly. "Okay, I promise." "Good," he said, standing up. "Come tomorrow morning." "Do you know the old library near the park?" "Yes," she said. "My studio is behind it in the small house with blue doors. I'll be waiting." She nodded again, almost afraid to believe it. He smiled once more before walking away. "And bring your violin," he added. "We'll see what kind of magic it still holds." When he disappeared down the street, she sat quietly for a long time. Her hands trembled, not from hunger but from excitement. Someone believed in her. Someone wanted to help her play better. That night she couldn't sleep. She kept replaying the moment in her head. The way he listened, the way he spoke, the way he looked at her not as a beggar but as a musician. She whispered softly to herself, "Mama, I think someone finally heard me." The next morning, she washed her face at a public tap, brushed her hair with her fingers, and cleaned her violin as best as she could. Then she walked to the blue-doored house behind the old library. When she knocked, Darius opened the door. "You came," he said warmly. "Yes," she said, smiling nervously. "You said you'd be waiting." Inside, the room smelled of old wood and music. There were instruments everywhere, violins, cellos, even a grand piano. Sheets of music were stacked on tables. He motioned for her to sit. "Let's start with your violin," he said. He took it carefully, turning it over in his hands. "It's old, but it still has life. We'll clean it up and change the strings soon." He handed it back to her. "Now play the song you played yesterday on the street." She took a deep breath and began to play. Her fingers trembled at first, but soon the melody filled the room. The same feeling came back, the one that made her forget everything else. When she finished, he smiled. "Just as I thought," he said. "You don't just play music. You tell stories through it?" She looked down shyly. "I just play what I feel." He nodded. "That's what real musicians do." For the first time in months, she felt safe. The small studio, the kind teacher, the warm sound of the violin, it felt like home. Darius gave her simple lessons that day. How to hold the bow better. How to breathe before difficult parts. How to let the sound come naturally instead of forcing it. Hours passed without her noticing. When the sun began to set, he said, "That's enough for today. Come back tomorrow and we'll continue." She smiled, holding her violin close. "Thank you. For everything." He patted her shoulder gently. "Don't thank me yet," he said with a grin. "The real work starts now." As she walked back to her usual street corner that evening, the city lights didn't seem as harsh anymore. The noise didn't bother her. She felt lighter, like the music had given her new wings. She looked up at the sky and whispered, "Mama, I think this is the start of something new." And for the first time in a very long time, she smiled, not the forced kind, but a real, quiet smile that came from hope. The next morning came with a golden glow through the city streets. The air was cool, and the smell of freshly baked bread filled the corners of the neighborhood. The girl walked quickly toward the blue-doored house behind the old library, her violin case clutched tightly in her hands. Her steps were small but filled with energy. She had barely slept that night. She had dreamed of music, of big stages, and of her mother smiling from somewhere far away. But mostly she dreamed of learning, of becoming better, of being worthy of the kindness Darius had shown her. When she reached the house, the old man was already waiting at the door, holding 2 cups of tea. He smiled when he saw her. "You came early," he said. "I didn't want to be late," she replied softly. He laughed. "That's a good sign. Musicians who respect time also respect their art." She smiled shyly and followed him inside. The small studio looked brighter in the morning light. Sunlight touched the instruments, making them shine gently. There was a warmth in the air that made her feel safe. Darius placed her violin on the table and began checking it again. He had cleaned it the day before and replaced the old strings with new ones. When she saw it, her eyes widened. It looked almost new. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It was always beautiful," he said. "It just needed a little care, like you." Her cheeks turned red. She didn't know how to respond, so she just smiled and nodded. "All right," he said, handing her the violin. "Let's begin where we left off. Remember what I told you, don't fight the music. Let it flow through you." She nodded again and placed the violin under her chin. When she started to play, the sound was clearer, brighter, more alive. Even she was surprised by how good it felt. "Good," Darius said softly. "Now close your eyes. Don't think of the notes. Think of what you want to say through your music." She closed her eyes. At first she thought of nothing. But then her mind wandered to her mother, the laughter, the songs, the nights they spent together before everything changed. The feelings grew stronger and her hands moved naturally, creating a tune that wasn't written anywhere. It was hers. When she finished, the room was silent. Darius didn't speak for a few moments. Then he said quietly, "That, my dear, was music." She opened her eyes slowly. "I just played what I felt," she said. "That's what makes it real," he replied. Over the next few weeks, she came to his studio every day. She cleaned the floor, made tea, and practiced for hours. Sometimes she played until her fingers hurt. But she never complained. Darius was patient but firm. He corrected her gently when she made mistakes and praised her when she did well. He taught her not just how to play better, but how to feel the music, how to use silence between notes, how to let emotions guide her bow. One day after practice, Darius said, "I've been thinking. There's a small concert happening at the community hall next month. It's for young musicians. I'd like you to play there." Her eyes widened. "Me on a stage?" He smiled. "Yes, you. You're ready." Her heart raced. "But I'm not like the others. They're trained, they have nice clothes, they belong there. I play on streets." He shook his head. "You play with your soul. That's what matters. Music doesn't belong to the rich or the trained, it belongs to those who love it." She looked down at her hands. They were rough and small, but they had created sounds that people listened to. Maybe he was right. For the next few weeks, her life changed completely. Every day she practiced for hours, learning new pieces and polishing the old ones. Darius helped her fix her posture, her timing, and even taught her how to bow gracefully after a performance. Sometimes, when she got tired or discouraged, he would tell her stories about great musicians who had struggled too, people who started with nothing but their love for sound. "You don't need perfection," he would say. "You need honesty in your music," and that became her rule. Days turned into weeks, and the concert date came closer. Darius gave her an old white dress that had once belonged to one of his students. It was simple but elegant. She tried it on and twirled slightly in front of the mirror. For the first time in her life, she saw herself not as a street girl but as a musician. The night before the concert, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window of the small room Darius had given her to stay in temporarily. She looked at the stars and whispered, "Mama, I wish you could see me now. Tomorrow I'll play for you." The next day, the hall was full. Families, teachers, and students filled the seats. The lights were bright and the air buzzed with excitement. Backstage, the girl held her violin tightly. Her hands were shaking. She looked at Darius, who stood beside her. I'm scared, she said quietly. He smiled. That's good. Only people who care feel fear. Just remember why you play, not for applause, but for the song in your heart. She nodded slowly. When her name was called, she walked onto the stage. The lights hit her face, and for a moment she couldn't see anything. Her legs felt weak. She took a deep breath and looked at the crowd. There were so many people, more than she had ever seen watching her before. But then she saw Darius in the front row, smiling at her. That one smile gave her courage. She lifted her violin, closed her eyes, and began to play. The sound filled the hall. It was soft at first, then stronger, fuller, alive. It wasn't just a song, it was her story. Every note spoke of her hunger, her mother, the nights on the cold streets, the laughter she endured, and the hope that kept her alive. The people listened in silence. Some leaned forward. Others closed their eyes. The music had something pure in it, something real. When she finished, there was a moment of stillness. Then the room erupted in applause. People stood up, clapping and cheering. She opened her eyes, tears shining in them. She bowed deeply, her heart racing. For the first time, she wasn't a street girl begging for food. She was a musician, standing on a stage, her music reaching hearts. After the performance, several people came to congratulate her. Some asked where she had learned to play. She didn't know how to answer that. How could she explain that hunger and pain had been her teachers? When everyone left, Darius walked up to her. His eyes were wet. You did it, he said softly. She shook her head. We did it, he smiled. You've earned this moment. And it's only the beginning. That night they walked home slowly. The streets looked different now, brighter, somehow kinder. She felt a warmth in her chest that she hadn't felt since her mother was alive. When they reached the Blue Door house, she turned to Darius and said, Thank you for believing in me. He replied, You gave me a reason to believe again, too. As she lay down to sleep that night, she hugged her violin close. She wasn't rich, she didn't have fame, but she had something precious, a dream that was finally beginning to take shape. In her mind, she could still hear the echo of the applause. But louder than that was her mother's voice from long ago, saying softly, Keep playing, my little one. The world will hear you someday. And that night she finally believed those words. A few months had passed since the night of the concert, but the memory still lived fresh in her heart. Sometimes she would close her eyes and still hear the sound of clapping. The cheering, the moment when she realized people were listening, not out of pity, but because her music truly touched them. The days that followed were busy and full of change. Her life was no longer the same. Darius's small house behind the old library had become her new world. Every morning she woke up early, cleaned the little studio, and practiced for hours. Her fingers had grown strong, her bow steady, her heart confident. Darius kept teaching her not only about music but about life. A musician, he would say, is not just someone who plays notes. It's someone who feels every sound and shares that feeling with others. She listened carefully to every word. She had learned that music was not just about skill, it was about truth. One morning, while she was practicing, Darius entered the room holding a newspaper. His eyes were shining. Look here, he said, placing it on the table. She wiped her hands and leaned forward. Her heart jumped when she saw it. Her name was printed in the local paper. The headline read, Street Girl's Violin Wins Hearts at Youth Concert. There was even a picture of her on stage holding her violin, a shy smile on her face. Her eyes widened. That's me? She asked in disbelief. Darius nodded proudly. Yes, that's you. The world is starting to notice. She felt a strange mix of joy and nervousness. But I didn't do anything special, she said quietly. He smiled. You played honestly. That's more special than you realize. Soon more people began to visit Darius's studio. Some wanted to see the girl from the article. Others wanted to hear her play. She was shy at first, but once she started playing, her shyness melted away. Her music spoke louder than any words she could say. One day, a woman from a local cultural organization came to meet them. She had seen the article and was deeply moved by the girl's story. We're organizing a citywide music festival next month, she said. We would be honored if she could perform. The girl was speechless. A festival meant a big stage, hundreds of people, maybe even cameras. She looked at Darius uncertainly. He smiled and said, Say yes. This is your next step, she nodded slowly. Okay, I'll do it. From that day on, her practice became even more intense. Darius helped her choose a piece that could tell her story without a single word. A melody full of sorrow, strength, and hope. He told her, "This time you're not just playing for music lovers. You're playing for everyone who ever felt small, ignored, or laughed at. Let them see what you've become." She trained day and night. Sometimes her fingers ached so much she could barely move them, but she refused to stop. When she got tired, she would close her eyes and remember the cold nights she had spent on the street, the times when she played only for food. Those memories didn't make her weak anymore. They made her stronger. Finally, the day of the festival arrived. The city hall was decorated with lights, banners, and flowers. The crowd was huge. People from all over had come to watch young talents perform. There were families, journalists, and even the same cafe owner and customers who had once laughed at her long ago. She didn't know they were there yet. She stood backstage, her heart beating so fast she could hear it in her ears. Her hands were cold and she couldn't stop shaking. Darius stood beside her, calm as always. "Nervous?" he asked softly. She nodded. "Very," he chuckled. "Good, that means you care." She took a deep breath. "What if I make a mistake?" He looked at her with gentle eyes. "Then you play through it. Music isn't about perfection. It's about courage. Remember why you started?" She looked down at her violin, touching its polished wood lovingly. "I started because I wanted to make my mother proud." "And you already have," he said with a smile. When her turn came, she stepped onto the big stage. The lights blinded her for a moment, and the noise of the audience filled her ears. But then she lifted her violin, closed her eyes, and let the first note escape. The sound floated through the hall, soft, delicate, but full of emotion. Slowly the crowd went silent. Even those who were whispering stopped. The music told a story of hunger, loneliness, and dreams that refused to die. Her fingers moved with grace and power. Each note carried a piece of her journey, those cold nights, the laughter that once hurt her, the warmth of the man who believed in her. As she played, she didn't see the crowd anymore. She saw her mother's smile, the streetlights that used to keep her company, and the old corner where her story had begun. By the time she finished, there was not a single sound in the hall. For a moment, everything was still. Then, as if the entire city woke up at once, the applause began. It started softly, then grew louder and louder until it filled the room like thunder. She opened her eyes, her heart pounding. People were standing, clapping, cheering. Some had tears in their eyes. Among them, near the back, she saw faces she recognized, the cafe owner and the same group of people who had laughed at her that first day. They looked stunned, unable to believe that the same hungry girl who once begged to play for food was now standing on a grand stage, being celebrated for her music. For a brief moment, their eyes met. They looked down embarrassed. She didn't feel anger. She only felt peace. She bowed deeply, tears rolling down her cheeks. She wasn't crying from sadness this time, but from relief. She had made it. After the show, reporters gathered around, asking questions, taking pictures. "How does it feel to go from street performer to city stage?" one asked. She smiled shyly and said, "Music saved me. I didn't have food, I didn't have a home, but I had my violin. It gave me a voice when I had nothing else." Her words touched everyone who heard them. The next day, newspapers and TV stations shared her story everywhere. People called her the girl with the golden violin. She became a small symbol of hope in the city, proof that talent and hard work could rise even from the toughest places. But she didn't let fame change her. She still practiced every morning in Darius's studio, still helped him clean the place, still played on quiet evenings just for the joy of it. One evening, while packing her violin after practice, she said, "Do you think my mother would be proud of me now?" Darius looked at her kindly. She already was long before all this. But yes, she would be very proud, she smiled. "I used to think music was only about survival. But now I understand it's about sharing," he nodded. "And that's why people love you. You don't play for fame. You play from your heart." Weeks later, she returned to the same cafe where her story had begun. It was a quiet afternoon and a few people sat outside. The owner recognized her immediately and froze in surprise. You're the girl from the festival," he said softly. She smiled. "Yes, I used to sit right there," she said, pointing to the corner. "I once asked if I could play for food." The owner's face turned red with shame. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I shouldn't have laughed," she nodded gently. "It's all right. Maybe it had to happen. If you hadn't laughed, I might never have played that night. And if I hadn't played, I might never have met Darius. He looked at her, amazed by her calmness. You're special, he said quietly. She smiled again. Not special. Just lucky that someone listened. Before leaving, she took out her violin and played a short tune, soft, cheerful, full of light. People stopped to listen. Even strangers walking by slowed down. The sound of her music spread through the street like sunlight after rain. When she finished, the cafe owner handed her a small basket of warm bread. This time, he said with a smile, it's an honor to feed you. She laughed softly and said, Thank you. As she walked away, the city lights flickered on, and her violin case swung gently by her side. The same streets that had once been cruel now seemed to whisper her name with pride. And though her journey was far from over, she knew one thing for sure. She had turned her pain into music, and her music had turned into something much bigger than she ever imagined. Years had passed since that unforgettable festival night. The girl who once played for food on the street corner had now become a name that people in the city spoke with admiration and pride. Her story had spread far and wide, not because she became famous, but because she inspired so many hearts. She still lived simply. Even though she could now afford many things, she never forgot where she came from. Her violin, the same one that had belonged to her mother, remained her most precious treasure. It was now polished and strong, but she never replaced it even when people offered her new ones. This violin carried my pain and my hope, she would say. It's part of who I am. Her teacher, Darius, had grown older, but he still came to her concerts whenever he could. Sometimes he sat in the front row, sometimes he listened from the wings. And every time she looked at him, she saw the man who had given her a second chance. The man who saw music inside her when no one else cared to look. One quiet morning, she visited him at the blue-doored house behind the library. He was sitting by the window looking out at the small garden. His hair had turned completely white now, but his eyes were still full of kindness. You're early, he said with a gentle smile. She laughed softly. You taught me to never be late for music, he nodded. And you listened better than most of my students ever did. They both smiled. She handed him a small envelope. This came yesterday, she said. He opened it slowly and read the letter inside. His eyebrows lifted as he realized what it was. An invitation from an international music school offering her a full scholarship to study and perform abroad. This is wonderful, he said, his voice full of pride. You've earned it. She looked down quietly. I don't know if I should go, he frowned slightly. Why not? This is your dream, isn't it? She nodded. It was, but now, I keep thinking about the children I see on the streets. They remind me of myself, hungry, cold, forgotten. Maybe they need what you once gave me. Darius studied her face carefully. There was no confusion in her voice, only sincerity. You have a big heart, he said softly. You want to help others, don't you? She nodded again. I do. I can still learn music, but I want to teach too. I want to build something. A place where children like me can learn to play, can eat, can feel safe. A place where no one laughs at them for dreaming. Darius smiled proudly. Then that is your true purpose. Music gave you a voice. Now you can use it to give others one too. From that day onward, she began working on her dream. With the help of kind people who believed in her story, she started a small music center for underprivileged children. It wasn't big or fancy at first, just a few rooms, some old chairs, and a handful of instruments that were donated. But it was full of laughter, hope, and sound. Every morning the children would arrive with bright eyes and shy smiles. Some of them had never even held an instrument before. She taught them with patience, just like Darius had once taught her. Don't be afraid to make mistakes, she would tell them. Every wrong note teaches you something. Every song you play is a story that belongs to you. The children adored her. To them, she wasn't just a teacher. She was proof that dreams could survive even in the hardest times. She often shared her story with them not to show off, but to remind them that no one's beginning decides their ending. One evening, while she was teaching, she noticed a small boy sitting outside the window watching quietly. He looked thin, his clothes torn, his eyes curious but shy. She walked outside and knelt beside him. Would you like to come in? She asked gently. He hesitated. I don't have money, he whispered. She smiled. Good thing we don't ask for any here. He looked surprised. Really? "Really?" she said. "But you'll have to promise me one thing. When you learn to play, you'll teach someone else someday." He nodded quickly. "I promise." She took his hand and led him inside. That evening, as she showed him how to hold a small violin properly, she felt something inside her heart. The same warmth she had felt the first time Darius helped her. It was like the circle of kindness had started again. Over time, her music center grew. People began donating instruments, volunteers joined, and even local schools started sending children for lessons. She never turned anyone away. She performed at charity events, donated her earnings, and spoke at schools about hope, kindness, and the power of art. Everywhere she went, people listened, not because she was famous, but because her story felt real. One day after a performance, she was invited to speak at a large theater filled with young musicians. When she stepped on stage, she looked at the crowd, hundreds of faces looking up at her, waiting to hear her story. She took a deep breath and said softly, "Years ago, I stood on a street corner with a broken violin, asking to play for a piece of food. People laughed, I cried, but I didn't stop playing. Music became my food, my hope, my strength. Someone believed in me, and that belief changed my life. Now I play so I can give that same belief to others." The audience clapped softly, some wiping tears from their eyes. She smiled and added, "If you ever see someone struggling, remember, sometimes they don't need money or gifts. Sometimes they just need to be seen, to be heard, to be believed in." That night, her words spread far beyond that room. Newspapers called her not just a musician, but a healer, a storyteller through sound. Months later, Darius's health began to decline. She spent as much time with him as she could. She played soft tunes beside his chair, the same melodies he had once taught her. One evening as she played, he said in a faint voice, "You've done everything I hoped you would." Tears filled her eyes. "I couldn't have done any of it without you." He smiled weakly. "You always had the music inside you. I just helped you find it." She held his hand and whispered, "I'll keep teaching. I'll keep the music alive." He nodded slowly, closing his eyes with peace. "That's all I ever wanted." After he was gone, she renamed her music school in his honor. She hung his picture in the main hall, an image of him smiling proudly. Below it, she placed a small quote he once said to her, "Play with your heart and the world will listen." Years passed, and her school became one of the most loved places in the city. Children from all backgrounds came to learn, laugh, and grow. Every year they held a concert in the park to celebrate music and hope. During one such concert, she stood on stage with her students, watching them play beautifully. Among the audience were people from every walk of life, rich, poor, young, old. And somewhere in the crowd, sitting at the same table where they had once laughed at her years ago, was the cafe owner, now smiling with pride. When the concert ended, she walked to the microphone and said, "I once stood on this same street, hungry and alone. Today I stand here surrounded by music, laughter, and love. Life can change, but only if you refuse to give up." The crowd clapped loudly, and she felt her mother's presence in the wind that blew softly through the trees. That night, as the lights dimmed and the children packed their instruments, she stood under the stars holding her old violin. She whispered softly, "Mama, I played for food once." They laughed. "But today I played for heart, son," and they listened. A single tear rolled down her cheek, not from sadness, but from gratitude. She had come full circle, from hunger to hope, from loneliness to love, from a small, forgotten girl to a light that guided others. And as she lifted her bow and played one last song into the quiet night, her music floated through the streets once again, the same streets where her story began, reminding everyone who heard it that brilliance can rise from the simplest places, and kindness can turn even hunger into harmony.